Alright, good morning folks. Welcome back to the Modern Explorers Guild Workbench. It is a new year, and our project with the Silent King, our painting with a dollar store makeup brush challenge is over. And so if you'd like to see more of that, you can check out our YouTube channel. M3 Guild is the handle. But that is all done. So this year, I'm going to be getting a new army. I'm going to be putting together an Age of Sigmar army. This is my first go with Age of Sigmar. I have played 40k on and off since about 1994-95, but I never did play Fantasy Battles, and I never played Age of Sigmar. So this is going to be my first foray into that, with an army that caught my interest. So what is this army? The army I'm going to be doing is a Slaves to Darkness army, but it is going to be themed with the 5th Chaos God. Yes, there was a 5th Chaos God. So, let's talk a little bit about the army, kind of the lore behind it, because that's really the impetus of all of this. This is a themed Slaves to Darkness army, and it's going to be themed around the 5th Chaos God, the Cult of Malal. And so, why haven't you heard of this? Why is this a thing that is not known very much of? Well, there were some really great articles that were in the Realms of Chaos 80s blogspot, and I happened upon this while I was looking through just some of the old stuff for Old Hammer. I have quite an affinity for the really old stuff, but there was an article in there in which a blogger, and I'm going to pronounce his name incorrectly, but it's O-R-L-Y-G-G, Orrillig, interviewed Tony Auckland and Rick Presley. And in this article, they talked about Malal and how it was designed and what ended up happening to Malal. So, the concept behind Malal was created by comic writers John Wagner and Alan Grant. And it was Caleb Dark that they designed as his champion. And I just so happen to have been able to acquire one of these. So this here is Caleb Dark, and this really started me thinking, hey, I am going to go ahead and make this army. And so this model was released in 1986 for Warhammer Fantasy Battles. And so as you can see, he is just a little human guy here, and he has this sentient axe thing. It's like a pick with a pterodactyl head, and it has soul-sucking abilities. So sadly there are no rules that are current for this, but I'm sure we can find him to be a nice proxy. He also was designed as a rider on demonic steed, and so this is him again with his helmet and his axe, of course, and then his demonic steed. So he's very small by modern standards. This is quite small. In fact, this is a Chaos Sorcerer, the new Chaos Sorcerer, and you can see that the Sorcerer is about the same size as the steed here. So we're going to see what we can do with this. We'll have to be creative, but after I was able to find this on eBay in Britain and get it shipped over some 3 or 4 months ago, that really got me started on what I would like to do for a thematic and, as far as I can tell, fairly unique army that uses this 5th Chaos God. So Malal is kind of the anti-chaos Chaos God that is chaos themselves. Oftentimes Malal is described as kind of a cancer that is part of chaos, but very, very destructive to all chaos. And Malal's power seems to grow and fail along with the other chaos gods. So that appealed to me. I thought that was fun to have a very kind of extra grimdark, very angsty kind of chaos god out there that kind of hated everything and wore goth clothes, and its colors were black and white, and its lucky number or sacred number is 11. So I thought that was fun. Just more grimdark stuff. Because if Warhammer is good at anything, it is taking things to the next ridiculous level and having a fun time with it. But I did start work on this army already last week, and I wanted to get an idea about what kind of concepts I could play around with, and I wanted to have an idea about where I would like our painting sessions to go, because ultimately this is a painting workshop. And so I'm going to want to talk about, or I'm going to want to show you, in fact, because this is a video format, this is show not tell, but I'm going to want to show you how I decide to paint this up and why I'm making my decisions the way I do. I already did a YouTube short on these swords, so if you'd like to know how to make these lava swords that have cooling bits on them, I do have a YouTube short on our M3 Guild YouTube channel. You can check that out. But here I've taken, here I'm taken some of the concepts that I've already talked about with the white and black armor, and I've already put it together here. I did want this army to be somewhat unique. Having played for quite some time and having collected for a while, I have some pretty normal looking stuff, as everyone does. You always kind of start out with trying to make stuff look like the box art, and then you move on to more interesting things using more interesting techniques, ultimately maybe picking up a challenge here or there and seeing what you're capable of doing. But in this case, I wanted to have something that's pretty unique, pretty interesting, and having a Technicolor base that looks kind of like a tile pattern, but then having a mostly black and white model was going to be something that I felt was a little bit more unique and interesting. So having the weapons be highlighted, being lava weapons, and then having the bases be very colorful as a juxtaposition against the actual model themselves being very two-tone in a way. So this presents a lot of challenges, but it also gives you the opportunity to play around with your white and black. So you can have your highlights, and you can still do edge highlights and things, but I think most of these models will focus on doing volumetric highlights, but in only black and white. The challenge with this also lies in making this interesting, because black and white isn't particularly interesting most of the time. So we add color to our models to have visual interest. It's not enough that they have good shade and good highlights, you also want to have some color to look at, most of the time. So I did add the splash of color here to the base. And I'm mostly happy with this. I did poll some people to see what they thought about it, and for the most part, the reception was positive. So I'm going to go with this. This is a pretty unique thing for me. Having a very technicolored base is something I usually don't do, but I feel like it fits what I'm trying to do here, to have a model that is mostly black and white, to fit Malal's theme, but also have some visual interest, so that it's not just a kind of dull, super grimdark kind of thing. But here we go. Malal's symbol is a skull that's black on one side and white on the other. I went to Thingaverse, typed in Malal, and I did find these as STLs, and so these were my first prints that I did. There are no official symbols that you can get from GW, and there's a good reason for that. It turns out that the original writers who worked on this, and let's see if I can find their names real quick. Yeah, John Wagner and Alan Grant. These two people actually worked on the comic book, and there's actually 4 comic books that they came out with. The Quest for Caleb Dark, which was in the Third Citadel Compendium in 1985, The Godslayer, which came out in the Citadel Journal in spring of '86, and Evil of the Warpstone, which came out in the Citadel Journal spring of '87. There was a 4th part, God Amok, but it was never released because there were legal problems surrounding the use of this. So it turns out that these people were working for GW, John Wagner and Alan Grant, and they kind of worked on a pseudo side project where Malal was kind of their IP. They created it so they would have something to work with that wasn't necessarily bound by the other gods, but GW didn't have all of their legal stuff put together back then, it being the mid-'80s. And whenever it came down to GW trying to claim that they had ownership over the IP, well, the 2 people who wrote the comic book claimed ownership over it. And so GW ultimately had to abandon the idea of Malal, although it does continue to appear for a little while. if you have, in 1986, there was an article about orgs, and in this they talk about Scrag the Slaughterer and Hierogoroth. It's a fun name, so I'll just go with Scrag the Slaughterer for now, but he is talked about as having an allegiance to Malal. And so they continue to use this idea, this IP, continued to kind of go on for a while, and it even continued on into 1995, but probably by accident. There was a role-playing supplement for Warhammer Fantasy, and it's called The Dying of the Light, and it was published by Hogshead Publishing in 95. And there was a Chaos Sorcerer of Malal named Heinrich Bors. So he struck a deal with Malal to escape the Chaos God Tzeentch. And it's not really known whether or not this was something that just kind of slipped through, or whether or not, you know, it's something that they were kind of playing with at the time. But at this time in the 90s, the legal issues had certainly crept up as they came up at the end of the 80s. And so this was probably just an oversight. But Malal kind of existed in this weird space for a while, but now it's been, as far as I can tell, fully abandoned by GW. But the idea I still find appealing. So, why? We've talked about why I've decided to do this. I find it interesting. I thought it was kind of a cool thing to have a ultra grim dark guy who hates everything, including himself, and to build an army around it. So all of the Chaos Undivided units in this army are actually going to have this theme going on. And I'll go ahead and pull out one of the other ones here. We haven't done the base for this one yet. You can see here, there was quite a bit of stuff in that STL pack. And so I was able to get all of these little skulls and some of these other things, and then just freehand this banner here. But this white and black pattern is going to be repeated on all of the Chaos Undivided units. Some of the units have to have a mark. And so for them, I plan on having the mark and then having the area around that mark continue to have color, like this one. So this is a Demon Prince, and it's going to be a Demon Prince with the mark possibly of Khorne or of Tzeentch. I haven't decided yet, because I have built a list, but the list is not entirely complete. And this is the new Demon Prince model, by the way, which I really like. It's very similar to the original Demon Prince model that was originally done, I believe, in 2002 by... I'll have to think on that one. But one of the more famous sculptors out there that did kind of the bloodletters and did the original the Demonettes. There we go. The Demonettes was another one that he's famous for. So I have these guys right here, and I forget even what they're called again because I don't generally play AOS. But I have these guys here, and they are kind of Minotaur people, and they were the first ones I tested this out on. So as time goes on, we're going to add more to this army, but right now what we're going to focus on for our first painting task is painting up these bases. And so you can see I did one as a test here, but I will have to finish up these other bases, especially for this Demon Prince, so I can actually hold on to the Demon Prince to paint him. And that's going to be the much more interesting paint job there. But here, for these bases, that's what we're going to be doing today, at least for now. We'll see how fast it goes. And we'll talk a little bit about the paints I'm going to be using. I'm going to be using some scale 75 white here for my white. I also have scale 75 black here that I'll be using. And then I'm also going to be using, in some cases, the matte black and the matte white for more utilitarian purposes. That way I will have, I don't want to use up all of my really nice whites and blacks. I'm going to be using those to do my volumetric highlights here, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to it. The bases have Phoenix Flames, Pixie Pink, and Moot Green. So those are our colors for there. And the area around the base is done in Steel Legion Drab. And you can even see here that even though I cleaned these, they don't want to close all the way because of GW's wonderful pots. But here we go. You can see they just kind of squeeze out sometimes. But we are now going to get started, and you might can tell here I have redone my camera setup to be a little bit better for painting and a little bit easier to see. And the bases, I'll talk a little bit more about those really quick. I really liked the Green Stuff World rollers for green stuff, but I found that they were a little bit expensive for me, and I thought I might need quite a few of them. And so I went to Thingaverse and I downloaded an STL of one of these pieces. So I just 3D printed this on a resin printer. It was actually printed on a you know, I'm not going to remember the name of this printer right now, but it was printed on our little resin 3D printer that we have for the store at Modern Explorers Guild. And I came up with this pattern here, and you can see I was testing various amounts of wetness for my air dry clay, which is what is on top of these bases. So I got some air dry clay from the dollar store, and I went ahead, rolled it out to about 1 centimeter, and I just eyeballed that. They're all a little different. And then I rolled this over them. After they had dried overnight, I went ahead and sealed it with some matte varnish from Citadel, and then I came and I sprayed it from 3 different directions. I sprayed it purple from one direction, green from another, and blue from another. And so this gave me kind of a nice color changing effect on these bases, which I like depending on which direction you're looking from. This is mostly going to be covered up, but you will be able to see a little bit of this. For these colors over here to really be as bright as they can be, we are going to have to paint them white to start. And so, oh, and this is a little bit of green stuff. This was for this Chaos Sorcerer here. So we're going to go ahead and get started on our bases that were made from our air dry clay that got printed using this from Thingaverse. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go ahead and put some matte white on our palette. We're going to be going through these one at a time here. We're going to be using a assembly line technique on these. This is not particularly interesting work, but if we want everything to look really bright on these bases, then we have to go through it. And so I'm going to be using this Citadel medium layer brush here. So nothing particularly exciting or interesting, but here we go. So we're going to mix some paint on our palette here. I don't want this to be too thin, but also not too thick. I would like it to flow. So we'll load up our brush here, bring this to where you can see it as in frame, and we're just going to start painting all of these little bits. And so this is one of those moments that things are tedious, but assembly lining it should make it start to be a little bit easier in the end. Just because you'll see each one of these pieces go by fairly quickly. We're going to keep our paints thinned relatively well. These cracks I actually was on the fence about, trying to decide if I really was going to like whether or not these cracks were a thing. But it turns out I'm actually pretty okay with them. I do like that it adds kind of an oldness to this. And so it weathers this stone pattern. And to me, this kind of looks like the Realms of Battle that GW did. And they did this kind of Age of Sigmar Realms of Battle thing. They're the really big ones. They're the 6 foot by 4 foot pieces. But they made these bases that go with them. And I wanted something that was similar to that. These bases are very similar, I feel. And once they're painted, though, they're not quite. But the pattern that's on them, I really liked. So we're just going to come here. This will take multiple passes. And I can feel the brush drying out just a little bit. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and wash our brush out. Come back, pick up some more paint that's thinned down here, and we can continue to hit up all of our spaces here. You can see I want to make these pretty smooth. I don't really want to add a ton of texture because there's so many layers on this. The texture is really going to make itself. which also kind of brings me to how thick some of this stuff looks on the other one. The paint's really not all that thick, but there's so many, this air dry clay has such an interesting texture to it. And you can see it shrinks, which is one of the more interesting things it does. So that's worth noting. If you make your bases exactly the right size, it will shrink around. As you can see from here, I consider this on this to be a feature, not a bug, as this is supposed to be kind of the floor of a temple. But if you were making something different that really relied on this being a bit more exacting, then I could see you not liking that. So just note that air dry clay does shrink as the water is removed from it, and it gets hard. Just going to continue on here. This also doesn't really need to be perfect. This is kind of an old temple, as you can see by the cracks. So if the paint's not perfect on it, that's okay. I do want them to still be strong colors. Not really for any other reason other than I want there to be a nice juxtaposition, a nice contrast between the black and white models and the temple floor, which really tends to bring out all the details in each. Just continue to come along here. We're a little more than halfway done with this first one. This is also pretty nice to practice your brush control here. These kind of tedious tasks give you an opportunity to improve. And while I know some of you, don't appreciate necessarily having to do this, I will say if you're willing to put in the time, it will give you something back. You will be better at keeping your brush where you want it to be, putting the paint where you want it to go. And this almost is like when you have to go on your chaos models, the old chaos models. I'm not quite sure about the new ones. I sold out of my chaos army quite a long time ago now. But the old models were whatever color they were for their chaos god. And then they had brass everywhere. Everything was lined in brass. So whenever you go to the forces of chaos, you just have this never-ending thirst for more brass on your clothes. But I remember you having to highlight all of that up, having to take your time and make that look nice. And that's one of the first times that I really got to practice a lot of edge highlighting for my army, because I wanted it to look similar to the box art, and that's what they had done. And so if you are interested in improving your edge highlighting just in general, going to get a chaos army or some chaos models and painting them up however you'd like, but then going back and doing the edge highlighting would help you. The reason that's a little bit better than some of the others is it's very, very obvious where that should be. So you're not having to kind of guess where you should be putting edge highlights. It's more, here is where they go, how well can you put them in where you see them. Alright, we're getting towards the end of this base here. And after this one of course is going to take the longest because it is the largest. And what we'll do is put it down when we're done here and move on to the next. Just double checking we have all these little bits and pieces. I have already established a pattern which I tested out on this other model, so we are going to follow that pattern when we put our colors in here. And so I'm trying to keep all of this out of the grout line. We're going to darken the grout line down just a little bit with some Seraphim Sepia. And of course I wrote all of this down because this is going to be a brand new army, and I want to make sure I'm consistent when it comes to painting the rest of it. And I don't want to get too much white paint down here in these cracks. So there we go. We're pretty good there. So this is again just to make sure these colors are nice and bright. So I'm going to put this guy down, and I need to be able to mount this demon prince, because this demon prince we're actually going to talk about and show how to do volumetric highlights, and we're just going to be, for the most part, using white and black, except for the area around their chaos symbol. And so that's going to be, I think, really the more fun part of this. But to get things going, we still have to do these. That way we have some way to hold on. And while we're waiting on the demon prince to dry, we'll be doing these. And this is a fairly thin white paint. Most of the time, whenever you're working with white in particular, if you put too thick of a layer on, it'll appear grainy. And so we don't want that. So you can probably hear, as I go back and forth, I am oftentimes cleaning out my brush and then just coming back, picking up a little bit of paint. So you can see just that little bit there. It's just the bottom third of the brush picks up paint for me. And then I come back in with some nice smooth lines. And the paint on my palette, so this is a wet palette that I'm using today. For the most part, when I was doing the Silent King, I did no wet palette. That was done almost entirely on a little sheet of tinfoil. And so making sure that my paint stayed the right consistency was actually quite a challenge, especially since I used so much of it each time I put the brush in, because it was all just dry brushing and stippling. Whereas here, this is a much easier task. You can see I'm having to fuss with it a lot less. And that's really the wet palette working for me here. And this doesn't have to be perfect as far as your brush strokes. Generally, you can see I'm trying to keep going the same direction here, just so I can make the transitions a little smoother from brush stroke to brush stroke. But it's definitely not required here. There's going to be some other textures added to these before we're done. And so what we're really mostly interested in here is getting this white paint on so that we can have something to work with whenever we put our other colors on. So we can have some really bright colors. Again, because our models are going to be in the white and black theme of Malal. I actually considered doing kind of everything washed out, but then like the visual interest on that is very, very low, at least to me. Maybe I could, if I spent enough time thinking about it and being more creative, maybe I could have found some way to make that black and white model be super duper interesting. But I've moved kind of the interest to the bases in some ways. That way we do see that there's a difference between the two for black and white alone than the colors. And I think seeing that really highlights both, the base being really colorful and the model itself being very kind of monochromatic, or lacking color entirely, actually, just black and white with shades. Okay. You may have also noticed that the camera's in focus. Amazing. It turns out I just didn't know what I was doing. And so, for the most part, whenever you're looking at the VODs and the other stuff from the Silent King, they're not the greatest. And that's because instead of focusing the camera myself, I decided to let it do it auto, because I thought, man, the camera probably knows more than me. It turns out, though, no, it did not. It was very sad. And so it tried for a while, but then after talking to my sister-in-law, who is someone who does quite a bit on Instagram and quite a bit on Twitter, not Twitter, I'm sorry, on TikTok, I talked a little bit about kind of my setup, and she showed me a lot of the tools that she uses to edit things, and that was excellent. So I got to see the tools, but I did not get to see how they were used. So that gave me some space to be creative in with the new tools here. All right, and then here's another base done, and so I'm going to come back here. So I'm going to put a layer on each one of these, and every time I do, I'm just going to come back to this demon print space, and I'm going to add another layer to it, because that's the one that we're really interested in, and I would like to start painting the demon prints on stream today. And so this is just a little bit more work that has to be done a priori. And you can see that brightens right up there, so that when we put our colors on it, it's going to be quite nice. They'll have a lot more readability, which is something some other more popular YouTubers have talked about quite a bit lately, is readability, which is how well you can tell what's going on at a distance on your model. And it's where we all kind of start too, whenever we're trying to start painting our models, where our real big reference is probably going to be the box art. So GW is really, really good at readability for their box art, and they're actually quite good at making their models. And anyone who's been around for a while has heard me say this, but there's a reason GW models are so expensive. It's that they are engineered with the idea that you'll be painting them. And so they go through, especially if you're planning on using GW's technique, you are going to have good results, almost regardless of your skill level. It just is going to be how long are you willing to put into it. So if you have the time, almost certainly you will come out with good looking models, things that look just nice on the tabletop just because of the way they were designed. Those are models that have not a lot of large surface areas, that have no kind of texture to them, and they're models that have very sharp edges so that you can run your brush along it to create a edge highlight and then make your model more readable because you're defining it more. Here, this technique, we will be using a little bit of edge highlighting, but for things like the demon prints, we're going to end up having to create volumetric highlights. And these volumetric highlights are going to be where we are wet blending a lot of grays. And it's really neat to see it come together in the end. Each individual step, though, is going to be similar to what you saw on the Silent King while we were working with that, but ultimately it will be a little bit more difficult here as we blend all of these things together with wet blending and with layering these in. And so we'll probably start off with wet blending things, and then as we get it all together, we will ultimately be using a little bit more layering. But we'll see that when we get to it. You may have also noticed that the other models that I have here already have kind of a highlight on them. And that is partially to save me time. That's just a zenithal highlight with a medium gray that was put on it. It's Vallejo gray. I believe it's just called gris, so gray, Spanish. I didn't apply white to it, but I did want to be able to see all the details, which is how I almost always start off my models. Normally I will spray paint them black. In this case, our store is actually out of Chaos Black, which is what I had been using, because we were out of Vallejo Black, which is what I was using before. And so now I'm on the Army Painter Black, which is fine, but I do prefer the others just a little bit more. I find that they have better coverage, they're more forgiving, they tend not to be grainy if you're in situations where you can't do things really well. So like right now, when you are priming your models, and if you're in a place like Michigan, you'll discover that cold wetness does not make for good priming conditions, as you know, I'm sure no one is surprised by this. But I found that some of the more expensive, unfortunately, but like Vallejo and Citadel sprays do tend to do a little bit better than the Army Painter. That being said, Army Painter has made quite a few changes to the way they do their sprays, and they really are not comparable to the old sprays that they had. So you can actually see the difference in the canister. Probably 6 months ago, maybe a year ago even, the pandemic still kind of makes everything warp into itself. But a little while ago, they changed a lot of their formulas for their spray paints, and they changed up how they did a lot of their the new made dropper bottles. So one of the big changes you might have seen from Army Painter is that they now include I actually don't know what it is. I assume it's a bearing. I haven't opened one of these to find out. But their new dropper bottles come with a paint stirrer inside of each one of the dropper bottles. Now, most of what we have at the store is the older stock stuff, because the companies are definitely going to continue to send that along as long as they have it. But over the next probably year or so, as we run out of colors and things get sent, and I can already tell because they have new SKUs, they are sending us the new stuff. And if you shake them, give them just a second because it's going to be stuck at the bottom. But if you shake them, you'll hear that they now have a little paint stirrer already built into them. And Army Painter, more so than some of the other brands, with the exception being Citadel, do actually need quite a bit of help in this department. Just because their paints tend to separate, and in Army Painter's case, they tend to kind of form a little goo bubble or a little goo blob at the bottom. And if you don't shake them really, really well, you're going to have a bad time. I will say the green stuff really does give you a much smoother texture. I'm not sure if I like that more than the kind of rough and craggy texture that you get from the air dry clay. It's certainly different though. Maybe for like a temple ground, I would prefer the air dry clay, but maybe if this were something a little more futuristic, maybe if this were like a grate or something in a spaceship, maybe that would be it. So worth noting there that the green stuff is much, much smoother. I can't say I actually noticed it at the time, but now I very much do. Yeah, that's looking nice. We'll come back to this again, because our goal today is, of course, to get this demon prince mounted up so we can start painting some of our volumetric highlights there, and we can talk a little more about that. All right. And you can see I'm still just building up my value here for the white. Just more layers here. It becomes brighter every time. And so then the paint that goes on top of it will also be brighter, because it'll have white as the background. This also helps to make it a much more opaque color when I'm done. Any mistakes here or any amount I don't get done shouldn't read as kind of, whatever color I put on with purple or blue or green in the background, but should kind of just read as a slightly lighter color because of the white. All right. Yeah, we're just going over everything again. Now I get to go a little bit faster each time because I've already gone to the edge, which is nice. So each subsequent layer is just a little faster. Wash out my brush. Get a sip from my drink. Which is actually hot chocolate this morning. I already had a coffee quite a bit earlier. My kids wake up right around 6 o'clock every day, no matter what. So I'm usually up about that time, and I do have a coffee then. But because we are using a normal brush now and not like a big old makeup brush, I will actually notice the shake. So if you're someone who finds that your hand shakes, like, when you're painting, you might want to take a look at your caffeine intake. I definitely notice the difference whenever I have had a coffee, especially on an empty stomach, and come over to paint. You notice it in particular when you try and do something like eyes. and you go to paint the eyes in, and then you end up getting paint kind of everywhere. Getting a little bit more white paint here on my palette. Just going to add it right there. And we'll come in with a touch of water. Mix that in so it flows. There we go. And here we are back. But yeah, if you're having a problem with your hands shaking, make sure you're not drinking a lot of caffeine just before you go to put some paint on the models. I have found that makes a really big difference for me. And making sure that I am kind of respecting that has been very useful for getting less shake when I'm doing things. I also brace my arms against the table here. I have a new gantry system in place, so now I can hold this quite close, and the camera's not in the way, which is great. A lot of this whole streaming and vlogging and all of the videos and stuff is really just about getting your equipment kind of in the right place. That's probably half of it. Having something interesting to do that people care about is also good. Making sure you're not like a toxic person is preferable. But a lot of the kind of noob stuff that goes on is just not having the right equipment or not knowing how to use it. And this is where this new camera system, it's actually the same old cameras, it's just now I read the instructions. So I figured out how to make OBS focus on something versus relying on autofocus, which it turns out was a terrible idea, because that's not how this wants to work. Alright. And this is getting very strong, so you can see quite a big difference between, 3 and 1. And you can see that color change effect, which is really nice here. It's still very visible on this as you turn it, because you can see you're seeing mostly the sides, and you see it turn almost entirely blue, and now it's going to turn purple, and now it's going to turn green, and this is all the same thing, but from the top it kind of looks like that. So that's another way of making some fun color change effect. You might be looking at this rough edge here. That's totally fine, because it's supposed to be kind of stone or tile or something, right? So we're making that. This is just I'll clean up some of this stuff, but the edge is gonna get painted anyways. It's gonna get painted with that Steel Legion. So it really is gonna try and sell that it's made of more of a kind of stone or block material. Alright, we have this, and then I think I'm actually gonna be done with it. I think 3 layers is probably enough. And then we're gonna consult our previously painted thing, our previously painted base that's on our Ogren base, maybe. Again, I'll have to ask for your forgiveness. I am a 40k player first and foremost, and this is really my first dabblings here into Age of Sigmar, and so the names of everything I will 100% not get right. But I believe this Wednesday at the store I actually have a game lined up with Mr. Alejandro. So we will be given a small game ago, so he can kind of help me out and guide me through AOS, the 3rd edition here. Just continue along. I'm not super worried about this being too thick. Could it be thinner? Sure. But again, there's so much texture on these already, just because they're that air-dry clay, that I'm not overly concerned about the paint adding a lot of texture. I just don't want to see brush strokes, because it's supposed to be more of a tile material, and you generally wouldn't see brush strokes in tile. At least my tile. Maybe your tile's different. Maybe you like the brush strokes. This is one of those hobbies that is multifaceted. So you can enjoy the lore. You can enjoy just building models. You can enjoy just painting models. You can enjoy playing the video games. You can enjoy playing the game itself, playing Warhammer in a store. You can play it with your friends at your house. You can build your models, and then GW offers you many, many ways to play with the same models, from Warcry for your AOS models to Kill Team for your 40k models. So you have all sorts of options to be able to enjoy this hobby both alone and with others. And it's one of the things I really love about Warhammer that as a kid, when I first started, I really didn't appreciate, mostly because it was the 90s, and while there was internet, it wasn't so far away from ARPANET. So the 90s and the internet was a very different time, a very different place. And most of the influence I had for the paint that I did back then was either from White Dwarf, or it was from people at my local store, which back then was M&T Card Company, run by a man named Tom. And so he eventually retired from that and decided that he was going to go meteorite hunting. And so he took off one day, and I never saw him again because he went off to the Arctic to go collect meteorites. I understand, after talking to someone at Dragonfly Games, which is the store that was in Sumter, that he had come back and was doing some other things, which is really cool. So kind of a blast from my past there. All right, let's take a look at this. I think I will go one more again. This is dry. So I will go ahead and put one more thin layer on this, just to give it as much strength as we can. And so I'm going to focus this only the places that I think kind of need it. And then we're going to move on to putting the colors on it so that we can get this demon prints nailed down here. So I'll have something to hold on to. I could just kind of hold on to the demon prints, or I could put it on another base. But I am going to put it on this base. And I might do something interesting as well. Where he touches the base, it might be that I make the base lose color there too. So the reason that they are without color is in the lore, when you are exposed to Malal, the closer you are to him, the less color you have. Just exposure to him kind of saps the color from you. So anything living around him kind of has this happen to it. And he leans in with the colors of his armor and other things. And maybe some of these guys have been so exposed that they then have a slight but still noticeable version of this occur to their area as well. Alright, that is nice and bright, so I like that quite a bit. And you know what, while that's finishing drying before we put our other colors on, I'm going to go ahead and take this, and I'm going to get one more coat on to this. And so this is actually a really good, because these are round and smooth, this is a really good opportunity to then paint volumetric highlights on this. And so we'll probably do that as well today if we can. So maybe we'll work on getting these two bases painted up and ready to go. And if not, I will probably consider putting both the demon prints and the sorcerer on their own little painting stands so we can get them painted up. I know there's, definitely a risk of getting paint on these bases once they're done if I haven't finished the model that's going on them. I'm willing to take that risk most of the time. I'm a fairly neat painter, and so I really haven't had a problem with that in the past. But in many ways, this is just base coats on here. So, not too worried. We could always finish them off later. Alright. So, let's take a look. I believe... Yep, so there we go. Now this is all done. I really do like that crackle look on this though. So just some variety. Have the very, very smooth and the craggly kind of look that you get from the air dry clay. You can see it's actually pulling off a little bit. You can see there's kind of a motion there. I will glue this down before we're all said and done here. These were put on with PVA, and what ended up happening is as it kind of shrunk, it pulled away from the PVA that was on there. All right, so now let's consult here. So what I can see here, we're going to start from the middle, and we'll start from, yeah, this little middle area right here. So it looks like we have these arrows are yellow, and these two pieces are pink, and then after that, it kind of spreads out from there. So let's start off with our Phoenix Flames right here. I'm just giving that a shake. In fact, you can probably hear that. Put it next to the camera. I'm gonna go ahead and put this on because yellow is very bad about separating. I'm gonna go ahead and put this on my test tube shaker. I am gonna mute you for just a moment. All right, now we have our Phoenix Flames all shook up. So we're gonna add that to our palette here. And I'm going to pull this out, and I'm going to go ahead and see where it goes. So it goes on here and on here. And then in this case, this will be pink, so it'll go on here. All right, and then it'll continue on to here and here. And to here and here. And to here and here. Alrighty. So I've just marked these out here so I know where they're going, and I'm going to get a first layer on them while they're still nice and wet. I do want this to be a nice smooth layer that's going on. So I'm going to have a fairly moderately thinned paint. Not crazy, but moderately thin. I'm going to try and cover up all of the white that I can here. And just making nice smooth strokes as we go. Same thing here. And you know what? As I go, I might discover that I missed one or two, and that's okay. I'll go back and I'll just put it on there. And let's say I painted one of these the wrong color. Well, I'm just going to paint it white again. And that's okay. It would take quite a few layers of white to totally remove it, but no problem. There's nothing that can't be fixed. It's just a question of whether or not you're willing to take the time to do it. Sometimes you may not have the time, so you just go, this is the way it is. There's certainly been models in the past I've done that with. Alright. So let's see. So we have this one, and then what's going to end up happening? So this one will be pink in here. So if this looks... going to consult this one again. So if that's the centerpiece there, those are green, that's going to end up being pink. Then it's going to be here that this one is pink. Let's see. So pink, pink, yellow, yellow. So then this one's also going to be yellow. Oh, I see what's going to happen. Okay. It's probably obvious I didn't super plan this out. But that's okay. This is also about having fun here, which is something I try and do with my hobbies as well. So this will just repeat on this plane, and then these other ones will keep repeating, and they will actually be pink, and that's okay. Alright, so now we have our first yellows in, and we're going to have to go back and find wherever the next pattern of yellows ends up. And so we're going to now put our pixie pink down on there. I'm going to mute you again because this one I can tell has separated, and I'm going to put it back on the shaker. All right, now it's all shook up. We're going to go ahead and put that on our palette. Yep, this one might be about done. Might be time for another pixie pink. There are some paints, I'll actually pick this up and show you. So here's my wet palette here. This paint actually is almost chunky. And so this happens just as paints get older. And in this case, I can still fix it with water here just by bringing it down. But eventually what happens, and you see this most often with Citadel paints, you can still see it's a little chunky here. Most often with Citadel paints, they'll separate. Averlin Sunset is really, really bad about this. And so it'll kind of form a little blob in the bottom, and all of the paint medium will actually be up top, and they will not go back together. There's basically nothing you can do to fix this when this happens. So just something to note. All right. So let's take a look at our reference again. I am just looking over here to see where the pinks are at. So that's going to be pink, 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 and pink a little bit. There we go. And it'll end up reversing over here on the other side. So let's get this in. Yeah, that's going on nice and smooth, even though it looked horrible on the palette. All right, and then we'll move along and we will create the same pattern on the other side. Again, I realize this is a really crazy looking color scheme on here. That is certainly not lost on me, and it definitely is outside of my normal kind of grimdark painting palette for the Warhammers. But in this case, I do think it's warranted. We're doing something that is, you know, kind of off the beaten path, that's interesting, and I feel like this is a totally fine use of that chance to do something kind of wild. Now let's see. It looks like these were going to be yellow too, but this is going to be pink. So we'll come back and continue there. So let's see. If this was pink, then that's pink, then that's pink. If that's pink, then that's pink, then that's pink. All right, there we go. So we'll continue on this pattern. I'm going to add a little bit more water. And we're just going to come in here, trying to mostly cover up the white. And you can see here, like this center area here is going to end up being yellow. And then some of this will end up getting fixed when we put the shade in the recesses. I do not want to shade down these top pieces. I want them to still be bright, and I'm going to actually accentuate that with an edge highlight where I mix some of my Wraithbone color into this color. I'm just going to fix some of that. It's a little bit too much white showing over there. And I'm going to highlight it up so it stays warm, which is what I want there for sure. All right. And then you've probably seen the other piece. It has greens on it as well, so we'll have to come back in and do that. Get you guys back into frame and focus. All right. Yep, again, I know this isn't the most interesting part, but it is showing you the whole process, which is something that you kind of miss on YouTube videos. I do enjoy watching YouTube videos where people basically have, you know, a model that's in prime, and then all of a sudden it's got all of its base coats on, and then they go bada bing, bada boom, you do this, that, and the other, and look, it's magically done. Yeah, they do explain kind of what they do, but there's so many parts of that that you're going to miss, and so when you go to recreate it, you end up not having all the pieces you need if you're not an experienced painter to say, okay, well, they kind of said they were doing this, but I look and I see in the intervening time they must have done this, because now I can see that, you know, this part over here has either something else done to it, or they dry brush this area, or there's some edge highlight on here that wasn't there before, or, you know, something. And so this way, if you're interested in some more long form stuff, this gives you the opportunity to see the entire process. And you can always skip around, not when it's live, of course, but once it gets put on YouTube, which they always do, they go up the next day, you'll have the opportunity to skip around and really find whatever section of this that you want. And I'll probably start working on adding tags to things. That way it's just a little easier for you to be able to find what you're looking for. All right. Now, let's come back here and take care of this portion here. So these center parts should have been yellow. And a little bit more water here. Let's see if we can't smooth that paint out. All right. So these portions should be yellow. Now, here, any place I got that, yeah, so I'll have to go fix that. You can see right there on the edge, I got a little bit of pink. And if you get pink someplace, you will not be able to put a lighter color like yellow over it and it work out. So we're going to come back and we're going to fix those places. Actually going to fix that right there. We'll come back and work on that in just a second. I think that's the only other place I got it wrong. All right, we're going to come back in and get our yellow here. And we're going to paint in these centers. Trying again to get most of the white taken care of. All the way down. Don't want to get too much paint in there because I do want to see these cracks, and if I kind of jam a bunch of paint onto that, it's going to cause a problem here. All right. So there's definitely still a few spots here that are going to need some work. And if that's yellow, then this is yellow. Go ahead and take care of that. This is really just pattern matching here. All right, so let's just double check what we got going on. That looks good. That looks good. This is the edge of that one. And so these were always yellow here. And so this means this is going to be yellow because this is also an arrow here. So that'll be yellow. Then again, I'm just lining up all my patterns. That there, and then this will actually be a little green chunk. Alright, it's so much easier to get it right this first time if I can manage it. I'll go back over there. So now I've repaired my little spot that was pink. And then this is also going to be yellow, but I know I picked up just a tad of white paint when I did that, so I'm going to keep that separate. Alright, so now it's time for our moot green. And again, I'm sure we'll find some spots that I screwed up. I'm sure I found some spots that are not quite right, but that is okay. We can always go back and fix that. So I'm going to grab some moot green out of my Citadel pot here. Get that onto my palette. Get the paint into the ferrules of my brush because I grabbed it poorly. So go ahead and wash my brush out here. That water's getting a little sad, so that's why I have 2 jars of water over here. I have kind of a pre-wash and a post-wash, and then what happens is eventually, so I don't have to get up and go replace my water while I'm live with you guys, I go ahead and I just switch the 2 around. Alright, so now we have our moot green. I have a little water here, which I'm going to add to my palette, and I'm going to thin my paint. Alright, so we have our green here. Let's consult what we have over here. So I know for a fact that's going to be green, that's going to be green, that's going to be green, that's going to be green. So this is just me going in and making sure I get these things. So I know that for sure. And so let's go ahead and get our green on this. And then we will move through and see what else is left. Again, I'm just matching the one I previously did so that they are part of the same consistent thing here. Up, and these little center portions here are also green. And that's great. Oh, that's too much paint. Let's get some of that off. There we go. And of course, these are all just the first layer of at least 2. There's no way to get these kind of pastel colors to be as strong as they need to be in a single pass. Which is also one of the things that makes your minis look either well painted or rushed. So if you have some layers and your layers are spotty, then it starts to look like either you just didn't have a lot of time or you didn't care. And, you know, it could be you're fine with that. But for the most part, I want to make sure my models look like they're at least a standard I'm going to be happy with seeing them on the table. So oftentimes that means it's going to take quite a few layers to finish all of that up. That way there's no spottiness. All right, so let's see what's happening. So this pattern doesn't actually keep going on this because that's a small one. So it's possible I should have done the big one first. That way I'd be able to see it. But let's see what we got going on. So if this pattern here are the yellows, and then this is the yellow, but then this is going to be pink against pink, it's possible that I want to... So these will be green for sure, and that will be green as well. So we'll go ahead and do the things we know for sure. And then it's just these right here on this side that might be a little interesting. I don't think I want more than 3 colors. You can go kind of overboard with colors. You can, do the opposite where you don't have really anything. Or you can go overboard and then there's just too much going on and the model just doesn't read as anything other than kind of a mass of colors that's doing things. We're just catching a few of these little bits here. So then do I want that to be green? I think if I wanted the pattern to really be perfect, what I would have done is had this be pink, this be yellow. And is that too late to do? No, I don't think so actually. The only ones that would really need to be changed are really these. So, you know what? Let's do that. Let's go ahead and fix this pattern. And so we're going to come back and we're going to remove this by just painting over it with some white. Yep, like I said, nothing that can't be fixed. So for this other side, I want the yellow to be against. And so with 3 colors, I can do this. You can't do this with 2 with this pattern. But with 3 colors, I can get that right. And so what is that? So that means this one will also be. So I can now paint in this as yellow. All right, and now this actually works out. Yep. So let's get this pattern in. And go here. Yep, and then almost all of this is just about brush control. Just making sure you keep your brush where you want it, keep your paint where you want your paint to be. There we go. And you know what? I will keep those center portions green, which is totally fine. And so get a little bit of green paint here. Come in. Get that section. These triangles that are in the middle. Same thing here. And these triangles. Alright. And then this little section over here, I realize I'm just kind of jumping around with colors, but this is me coming in, kind of fixing the little bits that I see that need help. Alright, so then this one will actually be pink. So this will be pink. This will be pink. And now we've got our pattern. Oh, and we can tell that was not entirely dry, so we're going to let that sit for just a minute longer. And I'm going to fix that with a tad more, and this with a tad more white. Same over here. Alright. Then this little area up here should be yellow. Yep, and you can see there's definitely white showing through, and when I turn it this way, you'll actually be able to see a whole other area that I didn't catch, because this has that kind of three-dimensional texture, and here it's really easy to miss little bits. But here we are. This pattern's looking pretty good right now. So this paint right here I can still see is a bit wet, so let's come in and let's work on this. So for this, let's go ahead and take a look at what this is. So I'm going to make this the, do I want it to be pink or do I, yeah. So let's make this one pink here, which if that's pink, that means this over here is going to be yellow, I believe. So let's see. So that's pink there. Then this will be pink. And I'm just holding it up to this other one. Pink, pink. Then it's going to be a real paint by numbers thing. So, you know, this is maybe this wasn't the best idea for speed, but it's certainly fun here. So we have that and that. Then those pieces will be green, I believe. So just touch this up. So this is going to be green, 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 and green. All right. I can definitely see me doing this wrong and being very sad. So let's go ahead and get this on. And it is a lot smoother on these pieces here just because the texture is not on them. They really just are. We have a little tiny piece of something right here, so let's figure out what that's going to be. So that's this piece right here. So that, oh, actually I don't know what this little piece would be. It gets to be whatever color it is when I get to it, because I don't think that actually is part of this pattern. So we're just coming in here. And again, we're just base coating here. Nothing particularly amazing. But part of this is just having hobby time, so won't always be some super cool challenge. But I think seeing this project come together, as you know, many people I know work on their projects at the same time, so they're put me on in the background, and then they themselves take a lunch break, and then they work on their armies. This is one of those things that you know, gives you a little bit of extra together hobby time, even if you don't have the ability to run out somewhere. Yep. I will say this is a lot easier to paint with this smooth texture on here. The kind of craggles and stuff on the other make it a bit difficult to get everything exactly where you want it and how you want it. It is sealed, and I strongly suspect if I had not sealed it, that would be creating another series of problems where the air dry clay would be porous and it would be sucking all of my paint in. And so then instead of just a couple of layers, it would be a lot of layers. I learned my lesson with that a while back on some more porous things. If something looks porous, it is. And if you try and paint it, you will end up with quite a bit of additional work. You can always cheat and spray paint it or airbrush it, and that will definitely help you but doing it this traditional way, I feel like it's a slog if whatever you're painting is porous. All right. Now I'm gonna grab this and come in here with the pink. Yeah, so this one, you know what, this little bit right here can be pink. This one we are going to do more of a volumetric effect on because it's smooth, and larger, smoother surfaces tend to lend themselves to doing something like a volumetric highlight, whereas more busy surfaces with lots of hard edges lend themselves towards doing edge highlights. And that's why you see, because heavy metal style that GW has is essentially an edge highlighting style. Like that's kind of defined by that. And so that's why you see such hard edges on their models, which in addition to making heavy metal easier, it just makes painting them in general easier. Because you do have lots of interesting things to just be able to paint. Alright, I'm going to turn this slightly so I can see. That way I don't miss something like this area right here, because I don't want too much white showing on these. None at all if I can help it, but I am going to end up doing a highlight on them. And so it's not going to be a huge deal. And then I can really see my brush strokes here. I don't know if you can see that. Those brush strokes are really wild right there. So we're going to come through, see if I can't thin that out a bit with some thinner layers, maybe smooth. When I say thin, I mean smooth. Let's see if I can smooth it out with some thin layers. Generally, the answer is no. Once you've done this, I did have a question a little while ago where someone showed me a model that had quite a lot of paint on it, and they asked, you know, what can I do to fix this? And my answer is, in general, you need to take the paint off of it, because as you add layers, even if you try and thin them down, they will actually pick up the texture that's below them, as if you were painting a model, right, that had texture on it. And so it's very difficult to remove texture with paint. You can do it, but the way you do it is you add another thick layer that you smooth out, and you do that a couple of times, which can cause additional problems depending on what it is you're doing. Or if you don't quite get that right, you'll just end up with lots and lots of thick layers, and your model will look somewhat interesting, but perhaps not in a way you had intended or desired. Right, let's see. Grab a drink here. This is looking pretty good. I think based on the time here, so we're at 1:20, so we have about 40 minutes left. I'm not thinking there's actually going to be enough time to really get this demon started in earnest. So what I think I'm going to do is continue to work on these bases and get our bases really finished off, and then have all these other guys mounted up, and you can see kind of what I'm going to do with these bases all the way. And then I won't show any more basing from now on. I will just have the bases done ahead of time. But in this case, you're now going to see basically all there is to see about the bases on these guys. And if there's any questions, you can always come back and look at either the VOD or the YouTube video, which will follow. So then these bases here will be just like all the rest. And I'm probably going to use air dry clay for large bases like this. The 40s, 32s, and 25s are going to have, this is, well, let's see. This I think is a 25. And this is a 32. So this is one from Caleb. And this is, yeah. So you can kind of see what's going on there. So now we're going to come back and we're going to add another layer, because we do want these. You can see they're not very bright right now. They're bright, but they're not solid. So we're going to come back and make them solid. And what's nice is that as long as I did a reasonable job the first time, this step will go a lot quicker, because having perfect edges isn't super necessary anymore, because I already did that. But this also gives me the opportunity to fix any kind of edge issues that I see. This one in particular I didn't do a great job on, so we're going to take a little more time here. But you can see this goes a bit faster now that we have our nice base layer put on. Right to the edge there for that. Do want to be methodical about this, otherwise you'll start touching stuff that you just painted, and that could lead to tearing, which we don't want. Or you just waste time painting the same thing over and over, but you're not really getting a layer of paint because you're just shifting around what's already on there if it's wet. One of the reasons you might have noticed that coming back to something too fast really doesn't help you out all that much, because the layers aren't building up. You don't build the strength of the color, you just move around what's already on there, not making it thicker, but changing its location. Right. And I am liking these cracks. I can definitely see where this would be a bug and not a feature for something more spacey. So maybe that's something else to consider. If you're doing a floor that you expect would have some cracks in it, you're probably great using this air dry clay. I think if you were doing something more sci-fi that really was like made of metal and you wouldn't really expect it to have big cracks in the metal, then perhaps it's worth noting that this is what this is going to do. And maybe you'd have to use something a little more expensive like Milliput. Milliput actually stays put really well. It doesn't not shrink at all. It does have a little shrinkage to it, but this air dry clay actually shrunk to such an extent that it very much cracked in 2 locations. And so that is not what I have experienced with Milliput. And then green stuff is just a epoxy. Like Milliput's also an epoxy, but green stuff definitely feels more plasticky, and it really doesn't move at all, at least in my experience. Perhaps I've not used a big enough chunk before, but for the bits that I'm using, I've never had a moment where I thought, well, this definitely moved on me, and now it looks different. Alright, opportunity to fix where I can see a lot of this white here. Then have all my brush strokes go the same direction, come along the side here and fix that. Yep. So for this right here, we didn't care so much about the brush strokes because there's a lot of texture on this thing, a lot of texture. Okay, so we did our yellow, we did our green, and now we need to do our pink. So, methodical again, coming from the top here. It looks like I missed that yellow right there. Or I just changed its orientation, so now I can see where there's a lot of white. That's why I like to, while I'm doing this, actually change up the orientation. I don't do it quite nearly as much when I'm filming, because it's difficult for me to keep everything in focus and in frame. But when I have this just on my own, I am moving this model quite a bit, this base here quite a bit. That way I am catching all the different angles. But again, it's very easy for me to move this out of the frame or move it out of focus. And so it's hard to do your best paint job whenever you're filming. It just is. You got so many more things that are on your mind. You are stream of consciousness talking for the most part. And so when I'm painting like this just normally, I usually will throw on just YouTube videos in the background, things I don't have to watch. Oftentimes it's a great chance to consume some news. Usually I have like Auspex Tactics on. Sometimes I have Planet 40K, who is a mostly just Necrons channel, which makes sense since Necrons is my main 40K army. right, that's coming together pretty well. You can see there is still a little bit of stuff down in these recesses. This is okay because this will get shaded down. At the last step, we're going to put a shade only in the recesses. I don't want all these nice bright colors to be brought down, and then I have to bring them up. So I'll just throw an edge highlight on them and call them pretty good. The option, I guess, exists for me to do that, and then I will come back and put a kind of a more volumetric highlight in the middle and then edge highlight. But that gets things a little interesting from additional work. And these are, at the end of the day, just bases. So we don't want to go too crazy. Yep, and you can see as I keep turning this around, I'm switching my colors back and forth, but there's not a whole lot of paint on my brush in any given moment, so that's fairly easy. You can see I am just fixing these spots where I keep seeing the white. Because for the most part, I don't want there to be little white areas on here. Alright. Come back here. Let's see if this is dry. It is. Let's get this to be a little stronger here. So we're going to come back in. That looks quite nice there with this final, or what I am now assuming will be the final. Yep. That takes care of that pretty nicely. Well, I will say that the battle line guys are all on 32 mils, I believe. Those are the Chaos Warriors, which I realized Chaos Warriors are not sold in anything right now, which is highly unfortunate, as trying to get them means you are almost certainly going to go to a third party like eBay to do it. I have tried to find something with them in it to put in my store, and it turns out it was the old Start Collecting box, which still had the old Warriors. Now, I have seen the advertisements for 2023 and GW saying, well, there'll be more Chaos models for your army here. Ultimately, though, that's later, and I'm trying to build this army now. So one can see where that might cause me a problem. Let's pull this right along the edge here. And I just feathered the brush here so that it's basically a wedge. And that allows me to get right along here without going any further than I want. Alright, and let's get our final green on this one too. Yep, nice strong tone. We're going to cover all of that white here. Yeah, the smoothness of this material, which is green stuff that I let sit overnight, is really nice. I can appreciate the visual interest of the cracked up bits, but having that be nice and smooth is really, really easy to work with. Alright, so we're going to let this stuff dry, and now we're going to keep moving on here to our bases. Alright, we have a reference model here. And you know what? Let's go ahead and take this large base and let's just completely finish what we can on it here before our time runs out. So now is the moment that I'm going to come into all the recesses with our shade. So I'm going to grab some Seraphim Sepia. I'm going to shake it up a bit. I'm going to take just here, this is all dry in there. This is one of the things I had done my oil washes in, which I had considered for this and may do in the future. But for now, that would be its own kind of moment, showing oil washes. So I'm going to shake this up. I'm going to take a monster brush. So this is a larger brush. I'm going to let it get filled up here. And I'm going to pull this out to work with. So the reason I'm doing this is going directly into the pot is fine, but what can happen is you can knock these pots over. And this is an original Seraphim Sepia, not the new contrast style of Seraphim Sepia. So if I knock this over, it's the old bottle, if I knock this over, I can't get another one. In fact, I know some people have had heartburn with the new stuff because it's very much a contrast paint that is thinned down. It's kind of in a wash style, but this makes it much less likely that I'll ruin my day here. So we're going to come in, nice smooth brush strokes, and we're just going to put this in the recesses, leaving the top parts alone. And this does take a second because we're going to go in between all the things. But in a way, it even brings out more of the color. So I'm just going to kind of do this in quadrants. And we're just working it around. Trying not to have too much on my brush at any time. But just go in between all of the blocks. And I am using that same old layer brush here. Do want to be careful what brushes you use. So I use this brush to apply base coats. So it's not something that is particularly delicate, nor is this an expensive brush. This is just your standard layer brush from Citadel. But this is not the place for you to use your higher end brushes because washes creep on purpose, and as they creep, they will go into the ferrules of the brush, and when they dry, they will cause the brush bristles to spread, making your brush less good for accurate things, like, say, painting something small or doing eyes or anything that requires some amount of both accuracy and precision. Oh, we're just coming in here, and some of that's going to get on there. That's okay. There's no reason for this to take forever. And so if I have to choose between getting this on the tops a little bit and saving, a minute, I will choose that, because again, we're going to edge highlight these things here. We do have to wait for this to dry, however, because if we try and edge highlight, and if we had perfect accuracy, we could just go. But what happens is if you touch this with your brush, and you pull some of that into the edge highlight, which it's going to try and do because it has very low surface tension, then your edge highlight becomes an edge low light because you're grabbing this shader and putting it into it. And that's not what we want. Luckily, though, this is not a super thick layer of this, so it will dry relatively quickly. And we're going to grab some more in here and get this in. This is also not the gloss version, which does exist. This is just that. All right. Now you can kind of see here that even gives you a greater pop. And what's interesting is that it runs into the cracks, even though I didn't put it there because most of the cracks connect to the little grout area. It does flow in and make those darker as well, which is nice. And so if you see here where I messed up, I can always pull that up on there and take care of some of that white. It's not a perfect solution, but again, this is not a situation where we're looking for perfection. We would be a little more careful on something like, say, the Silent King, where it's a huge, expensive model that we want to really look nice as a centerpiece. This is a Demon Prince, so sure, it needs to look pretty nice, but again, not really the centerpiece. So we're going to come in here, do the exact same thing, and the edges of this are going to get painted too, so I'm not overly concerned if I get some down the edge here. Yep, this is very kind of smooth material, so this really wants to float well, which is great. You had to work it a little harder when we were dealing with the kind of craggy things, because those craggy things really want to kind of hold on. Stuff wants to kind of flow in. Yep, it's going to come along here just for consistency. That will probably also get painted in there, but this will also help me whenever I go to paint that in. Alright, let's see where we're at. Well, that's getting pretty dry. Not totally dry yet, but we're getting there. So I'll put this over here with the rest of the syrup sepia. I'm going to get a drink. Alright. Move those guys out the way. While I'm waiting on that to dry, I might as well keep going here by putting in another layer on this. So I'm going to check my white here on the wet palette. Now it should be okay because I am using a wet palette, but you always want to just double check here. If you grab something that's a little crazy thick, might have some problems later on, but not too bad because again, we're on a wet palette. So one of the other issues you can have on a wet palette is that you have your paint on the wet palette and it looks pretty wet, right? But there are some volatile thinners that companies use that are in the paint. So while your paint may be wet with water, it is now missing the flow agents that they added to it because those tend to evaporate quickly. So even if your paint still looks wet on your palette, it may not work like you expect it to. And this is why if you've ever let your paint sit on the wet palette, come back to it, tried to use it, and said, well, it doesn't flow right anymore. What's going on? Well, that's what's going on. The flow aids, which are volatile, have already evaporated, leaving the water, which does help to make it flow, but those other flow aids really make a big difference. And when they're all gone, because they've evaporated or mostly gone, you're going to notice quite a bit of difference in the way your paints work. So, wet palettes are great for extending the life, but they certainly don't make it forever. There's definitely still a limit to how long. And so, whenever you're putting your paints on your palette, you think, well, I'll come back to this tomorrow. That's generally way too late. All those other things are gone. And some paints will do this a little more than others. I've noticed that Citadel paints are actually hydrophilic, so they like water and they try and pull it towards them. And what happens is it becomes too inundated with water from the palette. So then you're not able to really use that paint anymore because it's super duper thin. It's basically become almost like a wash on your palette. Alrighty. Okay, so we have that on. Let's double check this. That's still shiny down there in the recesses, so I'm just going to go ahead and use this time to put an additional layer of white on here. Yep, I can definitely tell this paint is not as fresh as it was when we started 2 hours ago, or an hour and 40 minutes ago. It definitely needs a bit of help here, but as we're kind of ending, or we're getting towards the end, I don't feel a great need to continue to put more stuff on the palette here. But like I said, this will be the only video that you're seeing all this base work done. In the future, whenever I have a model that needs to be painted for this army, which is my intention to follow this army as I paint it up, not in its entirety, but definitely the larger points for this project, you'll see them streamed, and they'll have no more base painting in them. Those bases will be complete. I also thought about just 3D printing them, which I could, and there may be a moment where I do that for some of them with different patterns. but I'll keep the colors the same. I originally thought of doing all of these on a cobble base, but ultimately I felt like painting the cobbles, even kind of brighter stone colors, was not going to be enough, and I wanted something that really, really stood out, that was really different than anything I had done in the past. And having kind of a, you know, amazing Technicolor base on here was definitely something I'd never done before. One could certainly argue that it's not a great idea. And that would be an acceptable argument, as it is a matter of opinion. Alright, so almost done with this base here. And then we'll check in on this other base, and we'll see where we're at. We're going to edge highlight up, and you'll get to see some of that. I'll actually pull the palette over so you can see what I'm doing there. Alright, so those now have 2 layers on them. Let's push those out of the way. Alright, so this is still taking its time. It's because it's a little cooler in the house today. I'm going to go ahead and mute you up, and I'm going to grab my hairdryer. And so I'm going to go ahead and cheat with the hairdryer so we can move on to the highlighting portion. And then I'm going to knock over all these paints. And this is, again, why we didn't have that open. So here you go on mute for just a moment. Alrighty. So we're going to continue to use our little medium layer brush, and we're going to come down here, we're going to edge highlight all this stuff, and then before we're done we'll put on our Steel Legion drab, and even if we run out of time I'll show you a little bit of that. So let's get some more white. This is just some more Army Painter matte white. I'm going to put that down on my palette. Pull that out, and then I'm going to mix it in through the tail of each of these bits. So we'll start off with our yellow, which I've mixed in here, making sure it's mixed well. I'm going to roll my brush. Oh, I was going to show you this. So I've pulled this white and I've mixed it into the tail here, making sure it's very mixed, and I'm going to roll my brush so they get a point to it. And then I'm just going to take that point, I'm going to remove some of it there off onto my thing, and then I'm going to edge highlight these. So this really is to add some visual interest to these guys. So we're kind of creating something that is a little more interesting than just the flatness of it. So we're going to come in here. Whoop. And this is kind of the downside of trying to paint on camera. This is somewhat difficult to really be accurate with it. Coming in here for this. And we aren't doing this in the pure white because this would stand out pretty crazy. But this is why, again, we wanted to get rid of most of the white, but not all of it. Some of it's okay, because it gets covered up in the very end by this highlight. And this is kind of where you work on your brush control. So I'm keeping this exactly where I want it, just right on the edges here. but we're moving along just a little faster so we don't run out of time here. Alright, on some of these big ones we can put some kind of striations here. Alright, pick up a little more of that white to come in. This is drying out just a tad, so I'm going to add a little water. Don't want too much water here when edge highlighting, because it's really easy for the paint to get away from you, which you don't want. You want to keep control over it, and one of the ways you do that, is by making sure that you have it thinned so that it will come off your brush and not dry in the brush, but not so thin that it really flows. Alright, and so now we have our yellow highlighted. And we're going to take our white and come in to our pink here. So we're going to grab our pink. We're making a pretty light kind of pink color. And you can, well, I can see there's still a little blob here from where this dried strangely. So we'll come in here. Well, this shows up really well. Alright, coming in here, just edge highlighting this out just to add a little more interest and to well define it. Again, we want things to be very readable, and that's what this does. Clean and readable. Coming along the edge here, highlighting this out. Give a couple little striations here. Because after we edge highlight this, we're going to basically be done with this top portion. There's still more to do along the side, but this adds just a little more interest. Coming in, just catching all of these. And you can see it just kind of brightens everything up on this base, especially with this highlight right next to the darkened down areas in the grout. And our last kind of big area here really helps to well define all of this. Okay, we got all of our pink pieces, and now we just have our green pieces left. Grab some white and bring that into the tail of our green down here. Mix that in really well. Then take our brush, make it into a point, and come and catch the edge. Again, we're not looking for perfection on this. The real big thing you don't want to do is get this paint down in the grout, because that's going to be very obviously a screw up. Like, you can say whatever you want about, well, I was adding texture to the top of this, and that's why this is here. But if you get it in the grout, that's a more difficult sell, and it just looks sloppy. And so people will definitely look at that and think, well, that's sloppy, and that's not where you want it. At least that's not where I want it. Let me clarify. You might want that. There's definitely a style out there of creating sloppy paint jobs, and that is a totally acceptable thing if that is what you're looking for. But if you're not, and this is what you're doing, then this is how to do it. As I bonked the camera, almost got away without doing it this time, but you know what? It would not be a blog with me if I did not bonk the camera at least once. Alright, so here you can see that those are all highlighted out, and I'll take care of the rest of these off camera. But I want to show you what I'm going to do to the edge here, and so for that I'm actually going to grab some Steel Legion Drab, because this is supposed to be a kind of stone of sorts. And so let's go ahead and grab some of that, get that on my palette. And we might go over just a hair, but that's okay. So we'll take this, we'll thin it down, grab some here. And we're going to come along the edge here, and we're going to get that in. You can see how thirsty this is, so you can afford to come in with a little bit thicker paint here. In fact, I'm going to put away my layer brush, and I'm going to get back out my monster brush. I'm going to clean this out, and I'm going to pick up quite a bit of this. And so I have now the monster brush, and I'm going to bring this along the edge. And so we're going to make sure that we cover all of that. And so this is to give you this kind of interesting cross section of this material. Now we'll probably have to clean this up at some point, because I am going to paint the rim black and all of the area under there. And we're going to slide this brush into this crack to get that in there. And again, we're going to come just to the edge here and do the same. We're going to keep going in there. And it's entirely possible that I get some black on this area again. All right. Just coming in here. Oh. Also a little out of the frame, but you know, so much better than it used to be. It's all those hours of painting the Silent King working for me here. Am I getting this all over my hand? I am not. Also, bonus points. Let's pop that off right there. And you can see there, this air dry clay was actually kind of a red color, but I'm just going to remove that there. It'll make my life a lot easier when I go to paint the other. I'm going to grab some more Steel Legion Drab. This is how much of this I am using, because the edge of this air dry clay, even though it's sealed, is still pretty thirsty. Not a whole lot of thinning with this, just enough to get the paint to flow, but really no more than is necessary here. Oh, we had that get on the top. I'm just going to remove that with my finger. No need to stress. And we'll come in here where this crack is at. We're going to add some right in there. Same for right there. So I'll have this along the edge, and in fact this is actually, it's not completely dry, but it's dry enough for me to get another layer in here. So I'm going to do that. I'm just going to get this other layer in here, and then I'm going to grab the hairdryer, and we're going to dry up real quick. And then I'm going to put the black edge along this. I think we're going to call it good for the day. This doesn't really matter how smooth I am, just that I don't get it all over the top, because the side of this thing is very craggy. Unlike when I am about to do the black here for the edge, that's going to be a little more important that it's smooth. So I'm going to go ahead and mute you, and I'm going to dry this out. All right, and now as the final portion, I am going to go ahead and put some black here. This is Army Painter Matte Black, and this is just going to go around the edge. We need a bit of it, so go ahead and put 2 drops. And then I know I showed you these scale 75s earlier. These are going to be for when we're working on the model itself and not the base. Mostly because they're very expensive. and I don't like the idea of using them to paint bases unless it was going to be for some kind of competition or unless it was going to be for something real special. But the bases on these do not qualify, at least in my book. So I'm going to get a relatively smooth first coat on here. So this is still kind of craggy down in here, which is why you're going to see me use quite a bit of paint to start. So this is a fairly thick first layer, but it is thinned down enough to where it should not give me too many troubles. But I found that putting black rims on my base, my iron hands are the exception. They have a gray rim around them, which is, I believe, Army Painter Necromancer Cloak. But I did for a very brief moment have a Cauldron Overlords army, which I just didn't like the way it played. And, you know, most of the people that at the store have heard this story because they ask me about Age of Sigmar every now and then. This is the story that inevitably comes out. That I played him for a while, actually painted them up pretty nicely to a Tabletop Plus standard, and then in the end, I didn't like the way they played because the particular way I'd set that up, their big trick was spell in a bottle. And so you'd take your airship, you'd run it into the enemy's line, and then you would spell in a bottle them. And it was cool, like the first 2 or 3 times. Then after that, it was a little less cool. But I'm sure there are better ways to play it with more experienced people that know what they're doing. That was just not me at the time. And so that was my only other foray into Age of Sigmar, was one battle at the time we weren't even a Warhammer store. Modern Explorers Guild was still just Pokemon and Magic, and maybe not even Flesh and Blood at that point either. Alright, that's quite a bit of black paint around the edge here. I am going to mute you really quick, and we're going to dry this out using the cheating method. All right, so here we are. That's almost dry. I'm not gonna sweat it, but it definitely matches the other one, and you can see exactly where this is going. So we'll have our demon prints here. The demon prints will be on this, and he'll look super crazy because he's on some kind of wild technicolored thing here that does need to be finished glued down. But right now we are out of time, and so you get to see the final basing here. The rest of these bases I'll take care of off camera, but that's the idea. The bases for this army are going to be very brightly colored, technicolored bases, and then the models that are on them are going to be mostly in grayscale, but with lava weapons. So here we are, a Slaves to Darkness army with the theme of the Cult of Malal. So we are out of time today. I am going to go ahead and end the stream, but for next stream, you can look forward to the demon prints starting to be painted, and we're going to be painting this with volumetric highlights. This is something that I think you'll find interesting. You'll get to see a little bit different technique. This guy is really busy, so there's not actually a ton of wide open spaces to work with. But we're going to do our best here using those techniques, and we'll see where they take us. So thank you very much for joining me this time here and at the start of my adventure for the Cult of Malal. Hopefully I will see you here next time, which will be at 12 p.m. this Wednesday in 2 days. And if you want to see more of this or want to review anything, this video will go up on YouTube at M3 Guild on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So, thank you and have a great day.